Welcome, everyone, to the Road to 30 podcast series, where we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of Patients Out of Time. My name is Marilyn Mathry, and I'm a master's prepared RN and the president and co-founder of Patients Out of Time, and I'll be hosting this podcast series. For those of you who aren't familiar with Patients Out of Time, this nonprofit organization was created in 1995 with its mission to educate healthcare professionals and the public about the therapeutic use of cannabis. At that time, cannabis was federally forbidden as a Schedule I drug, and no states were allowing it to be used as medicine. The founders of Patients Out of Time believed that providing accredited educational conferences on the therapeutic use of cannabis could help end this unfounded prohibition. And that was no easy task. It took us up to 5 years just to find an institution willing to provide accreditation for our first conference. Now, for those of you who don't know, cannabis has been used as medicine throughout the world since recorded history. It's a very popular medicine in America. However, with the alcohol prohibition ending back in the 1930s, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs had no one to go after. At the time, the head of the Bureau was Harry Anslinger, and he decided that marijuana was the drug to go after. Down south, it was being used by black jazz musicians, and they referred to it as reefer. Throughout the history, Mexico had been using it, calling it marijuana. So they created the scare of this new drug, marijuana, and did a reefer madness campaign. This resulted in the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which put high taxes on this medicine, despite the fact that the American Medical Association was against this move because they did recognize cannabis as medicine. But anyway, it was dropped from the U.S. Pharmacopoeia in 1942. Decades later, with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, marijuana was wrongly placed in Schedule I, or the forbidden category of psychoactive drugs. About that time, Keith Stroup founded NORML, a young lawyer. He founded the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and they began the process of challenging the placement of marijuana in Schedule I. By 1983 to 85, I was back in grad school, and I went through NORML to do my thesis on marijuana disclosure to healthcare professionals. This was the time of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign to fight drug abuse, and the arrests for marijuana were climbing. Marijuana was the most used illicit drug at the time, and I wondered if people would admit to using marijuana to their doctor or nurse. So NORML was my gateway to potential marijuana smokers. They let me send the survey through their mailing list. Anyway, this graduate work opened my eyes to the medical history of cannabis, and after graduation, I did volunteer work with NORML as the director of their Council on Marijuana and Health. And I met many of my cannabis mentors, including Robert Randall and O'Leary Randall, who were running the Alliance for Cannabis Therapeutics, or ACT, and learned about the little-known secret of the federal government. On the one hand, the government had listed cannabis as a Schedule I drug, meaning it's highly addictive, it has no accepted medical value in the United States, and it's not safe for patient use. While on the other hand, the government was providing government-grown cannabis to 5 patients. For the NORML conference in 1990, we arranged to have a panel of those 5 patients: Robert Randall, Irvin Rosenfeld, Elvie Masica, Corinne Millett, and George McMahon. We made a short video film, Marijuana as Medicine, that featured those 5 patients, and it's available on our website for viewing. In 1992, the federal government closed that program, and at that time, 1992, there were about 15 patients now in the program, with 30-some being okayed to get their medicine and hundreds waiting to get into the program. Most of those were HIV/AIDS patients. However, by 1995, 3 years later, only 8 of those 15 patients were still living. And that prompted the creation of Patients Out of Time. We realized that patients were suffering now due to no access to this medicine, and education was the key to ending the prohibition. So during these monthly podcasts, we'll be interviewing medical cannabis trailblazers we've worked with over the years. You'll hear from healthcare professionals, cannabis researchers, patients, advocates, policymakers, and more. Our guests will share their stories and their experiences with cannabis. It's been a long road filled with tragedies, roadblocks, setbacks, but our trailblazers have bravely forged ahead to get to the truth. And today you'll meet 3 of those early cannabis pioneers who sparked the formation of Patients Out of Time. First, we'll be talking to is Alice O'Leary, and she and Bob have published several books. Alice's latest book was Medical Marijuana in America, Memoir of a Pioneer. And with Eloise Thiessen, a nurse practitioner, they co-wrote a book, Pain Free with CBD. And then in the earlier years, there's Marijuana RX, the early years, 1976 to 1996, the story of the American medical marijuana movement by both Robert Randall and Alice O'Leary. And one of our patient guests is Irvin Rosenfeld. And Irv has also published a book about his story, and that's the name of his book is My Medicine.
Hi, everyone. This is Cheryl Murray Powell, Esquire. I'm super excited about our Road to 30 podcast series. This is your opportunity to really get to know people that we hold dear in our heart because of their sacrificial work with regards to the legalization of cannabis and making sure there's access for patients to the cannabis plant. I'm a cannabis agricultural dietary supplement trade and regulatory attorney, and as mentioned, I'm on the board of Patients Out of Time, one of the oldest advocacy organizations with regards to cannabis and education on medical cannabis. Patients Out of Time granted the first CMEs with regards to cannabis education, and that's how we got here with regards to legalization. Having educated physicians and having informed patients make choices as far as cannabis as an option for treatment. When I was asked to be a part of the Patients Out of Time board, I was over the moon excited about this opportunity because I'm very familiar with the work that has been done. We stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to this cannabis plant legalization and the advocacy that led us to this place where we can see open consumption of cannabis for the patient community, where they're not ostracized and stigmatized in multiple states. Although we've come very far, there's a long way to go, and we're hoping that you'll join us on this road to 30 as we inform and educate and advocate for the next era with regards to cannabis legalization and access for patients. I'm now going to hand back to Mary Lynn so that she can introduce our panel today.
All right, for first up, we're going to talk to Alice O'Leary Randall. And Alice, if you can just give the folks a brief introduction about yourself.
Sure. Hi, Mary Lynn, and hi, everyone. I'm so happy you could join us in this inaugural broadcast from the Road to 30 podcast. I've been involved in the medical marijuana movement from the very beginning. My late husband, Robert Randall, was the first legal medical marijuana patient in the modern era. And he obtained legal access in 1976, which is almost 50 years ago. It was quite a big news story because there was no medical marijuana in 1976. Harry Anslinger had done a good job of eliminating cannabis from the eliminating cannabis from the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. And a lot of doctors had literally forgotten about it. But Robert accidentally discovered that it helped his glaucoma. He was diagnosed with glaucoma in 1972 at the age of 24. And he didn't believe it at first, but with a little bit of methodical testing, he proved it to himself. He told me, and we kept it as, pardon me. But with a little bit of methodical testing, he proved it to himself, and then he told me, and we didn't tell anyone else. We were arrested in August of 1975, and after getting arrested, discovered that the federal government, knew that marijuana could help glaucoma, but they hadn't really told anybody else. So this came as a very big surprise to us. And it was the decision, it made the difference in making our decision about how to proceed. We decided to fight the charges, and in November of 1976, Robert was found not guilty by reason of medical necessity. That was the first time that defense was used, and it was successful, and it's based on common law. which dates back to the Magna Carta. At the same time, in November of 1976, the petition to the National Institute on Drug Abuse asking that Robert be allowed to use medical marijuana from the federal government, that petition was granted in the same month of November 1976. So it was a momentous month, and it led to the rest of our lives.
Thank you very much, Alice. And then next, we'll be talking with Irv Rosenfeld. Irv Rosenfeld was the second patient to get into this program. And Irv, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, Mary Lynn. Again, my name is Irvin Rosenfeld. And when I was 10 years old, I was diagnosed with multiple congenital cartilaginous exostosis, which meant I had bone tumors, over 200 of them, in my body that could grow and cause problems to where I'd have to have surgeries. And so I took all the normal medications that were available at that time. It was from Dilaudid to methaqualone to all kinds of medicines. And I was an advocate against marijuana during that time because, again, marijuana was illegal. And how could an illegal drug be more beneficial than the legal drugs that my doctors were prescribing to me? I decided to go to college in '71 to Miami, to Miami-Dade South. And there I was exposed to marijuana. I gave in to peer pressure to make friends. And I didn't get high. I thought it was pure garbage. But I was accepted, I was making friends, and that's all I cared about. So by the 10th time I did it, I was playing a game of chess, which I hated. And so it took me 30 minutes to lose. And when I lost, I stood up. And it dawned on me I sat for 30 minutes. Now I hadn't sat for 30 minutes in over 5 years. I normally sit for 10 minutes and stand for 10 minutes. And here I was able to sit for 30 minutes. So immediately I thought, in what way did I take all the narcotics and drugs that I had prescribed to me? And I hadn't taken anything for 6 hours. Well, how could I sit? And just then the marijuana was passed to me. It was my turn. I looked at this garbage, because to me that's all marijuana was pure garbage. And I thought, gee, this is the only thing I've done differently. I've smoked this garbage. I wonder if there's any medical benefit to this garbage. So the next day I called my orthopedic surgeon, who knew me since age 10. And I also called my uncle, who was a pediatrician at Yale, and my great uncle, who at one point was head of pediatrics at Johns Hopkins. And I told him what happened. I said, I think marijuana might have some medical benefit to it. And so back then, this was 1971, there was no internet. There was no one place to go, so you had to go to the library and do your own research. And that's what we did, all three of us. And we found that, lo and behold, that marijuana had been used as a medicine throughout centuries, and that apparently it might be the medicine for me. So I used it some more, and I found that it really was very, very beneficial for my bone disorder. It relaxed the muscles going over my tumors. It was a mild analgesic. It helped with the pain. And more importantly, it gave me confidence that I could move and not worry about hurting myself as much. So I used it, and I got along much better. Well, 6 months went by, and my friends were getting busted. And I knew it was only a matter of time until I got busted. And here I was, a patient. I wasn't a criminal. I was using it as a medicine along with the other prescriptions. So I didn't want to take a chance on being arrested. So I had learned about the compassionate care protocol. And that was what was given to patients who could prove that the marijuana was beneficial for their disorder. And if somehow you could get through the labyrinth of government bureaucracy, that was possibly a potential for you to use as a medicine. So I knew I couldn't do that in Florida. So I went back to Virginia, which was my hometown and home state. And there I decided to take on the federal government and try to get my medicine. Now, in 1976, Bob Randall had gotten it for his glaucoma, and he started going around to college campuses. And one of the college campuses he went to was Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. And so I went and heard him speak. And he was very articulate, amazing speaker. And that's how we met at OD. And so I told him what I'd done so far, as far as trying to put together my own protocol and or my own scientific project. And he said, Irvin, we're not going to try to prove that it's scientifically beneficial. We're going to prove that there's a doctor who believes it is. And let's apply to the federal government on his behalf. So the doctor that we were talking about was my orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Henry Wave. Well, Dr. Henry Wave, right after that, contacted hepatitis surgery, and it killed him. And so now I didn't even have a doctor to operate on me for my tumors, nor to take over a potential protocol taking on the federal government. So that kind of was a bummer. But Bob, again, when I met him, he said that there's a chance that the government might give it to me, but very little. And that here I fought for 5 years, and I would have to fight for another 5 years. Was I willing to do that? I told him I was. He said, the government may not give it to you. I said, the government had no intentions of giving it to you, but they did. So therefore, I had a potential that there might be a chance for me to get on the government program. So I continued. And it took me 10 years, 10 years from 72 to 82 to convince the federal government that my protocol, which Bob and Alice helped me put together, was viable. And that's what I did. Now, during that time, I had the University of Virginia Law School behind me. I had the state of Virginia behind me. I passed laws in Virginia. So it was hard. I had to work a lot, but I did. And finally, the government, we threatened, UVA threatened to sue the federal government on our behalf. And the government decided, FDA decided, they were going to hold hearings for me. And so the Professor Richard Bonney called me and said, Irvin, you've got a hearing now in FDA in Rockville, Maryland that you've got to go to. He said, you've got 15 minutes to convince 20 doctors that your project is valid. He said, you're not going to do it. He said, you're not going to win. He said, but we have to do that. And once we do that, then we'll go into court and sue the way Steptoe and Johnson did for Bob Randall at one point. And so I thought, well, if that's what we have to do, that's what we do. So I went to Rockville, Maryland, which was a 250-mile drive from Portsmouth, Virginia. And it gave me a lot of time to think about what I was going to say. So I got to Rockville and I got to FDA, which is a huge building. And so I had 15 minutes to convince 20 doctors. And I was able to do that. And the way I was able to do that, which is very important, I think, is the doctors had no intentions of giving me my medicine. And they opened it up to questions. And in the audience were about 100 doctors, 100 people. And one was an oncologist from Venezuela. And he stood up and he said, gentlemen, he said, I'm here to study pain treatments for cancer patients for my country, Venezuela. And what I've learned so far is that the best medicine is Dilaudid. And in my 15 minutes, I had said that when I took marijuana with Dilaudid, it enhanced the effects of Dilaudid, so I didn't have to take as much Dilaudid. He said, Irvin, he said, this is remarkable. He said, this needs to be studied with a regular supply of marijuana. And when that happened, you should have seen the 20 faces of those doctors. It's like, oh, shit, we just lost. And so at that point, I was pretty excited. And the chairman said, are there any more comments? And there were none. And the chairman looked at the other 19 doctors, and they all kind of looked away from him. And then he looked at me. He said, Mr. Rosenfeld, I can say now that your presentation was very eloquent and convincing, and you'll become the second person in the United States to receive medical cannabis under the auspices of the federal government. So at that moment, there was Bob, the first patient, and me as the second patient. And one thing I've got to say is I felt very comfortable being the second patient. I really did, because Bob was brilliant, and he could say something better than I could in some ways. So I loved being number two to him, and so it was nice to have him as a leader, and he led. And then when he got sick in 2000, he'd gotten sick, and then when he got really sick in 2001, I went over to their house in Florida, because I was in Florida at that point. And that's when he said, Irvin, he said, I've got AIDS. He said, I don't know how much longer I'm going to live. He said, I don't have the strength to continue the fight. He said, you got to do it. And so that drive back to Fort Lauderdale, which was 250 miles, was a horrible trip. But I knew I had to take over, and I did. And to this day, now 30 years later, here we are. And so we're hoping that we can get more word out about it, and that, there'll be more patients. And of course, it's grown. I mean, we've got almost every state now that's passed laws, and patients are using the medicine. And I like to believe that, that I had a lot to do with that I was able to convince the government for me, and then continue to speak at other states. And between Bob and I think we did a good job of getting the word out.
Thank you, Irv, giving us that background. And then the third speaker we have for today, our third guest, is Dr. Juan Sanchez-Ramos, affectionately called Zeno, and I'll let him give his introduction.
Thank you for allowing me to continue participation with patients at a time. As a background, I should mention that I am a physician scientist. I have a PhD in behavioral pharmacology, a medical degree, specialty in neurology and in movement disorders. My PhD was a second thought. Initially, I was going to be a professional artist, and I tried for about till I was 23 years of age. And during that time, my friends called me Zeno. I used that as my pen name. But when I realized I couldn't survive as an artist, I decided to go back to the University of Chicago, where I had done my undergraduate work. And I had a friend who put me in contact with Bob Schuster, who was in the Department of Pharmacology and Psychiatry. And he was doing some very interesting research that appealed to me. So I wrote to him, and I looked at all the application requirements for a PhD, and found that Bob Schuster was interested in taking me as a graduate student. And what interested him in me was that I had this artist background. And I didn't know this at the time until he told me, maybe in a year later, that he had been a jazz musician until he was 35 or so. And then he went to graduate school and became a behavioral pharmacologist. And his main focus was opiate dependence. And it's because many of his jazz musician friends were heroin addicts, or basically were dependent on opioids. So his research was very pioneering. He developed animal models of drug dependence where rhesus monkeys would self-administer opioids or psychomotor stimulants, etc. And what he liked about what I could do is that I might be able to focus on the neuroanatomical networks involved in opioid action that lead to dependence and withdrawal. So to make a longer story short and get right to the reason I'm here is that Bob Schuster later became the head of National Institute of Drug Abuse, and I always kept in touch with him when he left. But once I finished my PhD work, I got bored in the lab, and I did a PhD to MD degree program. And during my neurology training, I decided to become a movement disorder specialist, and mostly focusing on Parkinson's disease, where patients have marked rigidity, slowness, tremors. And during my time looking into Parkinson's disease, I came across some very interesting literature on the use of cannabis indica to treat Parkinsonism, or they called it paralysis agitans in the 19th century. So William Gower wrote a manual of neurology published in 1888, and he detailed the use of cannabis indica for treating this movement disorder. So that was the background upon which Irv heard about me, right? Because he needed another physician to take over management of the study. So in 1990, I met Irv, and I was immediately interested in getting involved in the compassionate use protocol of cannabis for the treatment of his muscle rigidity and spasms. There was a certain overlap between his condition and my specialty of movement disorders, though it's very different in terms of etiology and how we normally manage it. So I figured that if I'm involved in this very interesting study and I get to follow him for many years and see how effective it is, I can measure the changes in his muscle spasticity, the muscle rigidity and muscle spasms. And of course, it alleviated pain. So one of the wonderful things that happened to him is that he was able to stop all the opioid drugs and maintain control of his disorder with medical marijuana. And he told me that I had the chance, if I'm willing, and go through a certain number of procedural steps to take over the management of his case in the compassionate use protocol. This was around 1990. Well, there's a number of steps that have to be done before I could do this. And one, besides getting a Schedule I license from the DEA, which wasn't as hard as I thought it would be, was to get my investigational review board at the University of Miami to approve this study. And it's a very conservative group, the investigational review board. But I was able to convince them with my past history of working with Bob Schuster, of having a PhD in behavioral pharmacology and being an expert on the use of opioids and withdrawal, and the fact that I was a movement disorder specialist that could look at Irv's movement disorder and study the changes that would be produced by his use of medical marijuana. So I took on that position, and I did it for 6 years. I should mention that the DEA part was not bad because I had the IRB approval. The IRB approval was given contingent on getting a Schedule I license. But fortunately, after I sent all the paperwork to the DEA, including the IRB approval with their contingency, they approved it. They just needed to come and see where we would store the medical cannabis canisters that would be sent, every 6 months. So it had to be in a safe. The research pharmacy had to receive it initially, and then they would bring it over to my clinic, and I'd lock it in another safe in my clinic and then give it to Irv when he came by after I did my thorough evaluation. So what I was following in Irv was the extent of relief of his muscle spasms and rigidity, and of course pain. But pain is harder it's so subjective, but muscle spasms, rigidity is something I could detect. So every time I saw him, I would write a report, and that was the kind of the end point was to see how much improvement we could get. Now, because I took a job at the University of South Florida in Tampa, we had to find someone else that could manage his case, and we were able to find a neurologist who took over as the physician in charge of Irv's case. So I'm so impressed that Irv is doing as well as he is, because he's got a terrible condition. I haven't seen him in a long time, but the fact is, we did write a review article of all of the living patients that had been in this compassionate use protocol. And what I'm most impressed is how little impact it has on his cognitive function, on any of their cognitive function, when the mythology was that it really is bad for your thinking processes. But there's very little impact on that. The main impact that we saw in this adverse effect was slight changes in pulmonary function. And the reason that is likely because the cannabis provided by the National Institute of Drug Abuse was like, I forget who mentioned it to me, it was more like hemp than cannabis indica. It had very low percentage of THC, so people had to smoke from 10 to 12 cigarette joints, big fat cigarette joints a day. So all that particulate matter into the lungs is bound to cause some problems with lungs, but it was not incapacitating. So it was very safe, and it didn't have a lasting effect on cognition. And it was helpful for the muscle spasms and rigidity and for relief of pain, to the point he didn't need opioid analgesics any longer. So I'm very pleased to continue to participate as much as I can with Patients Out of Time. And I hope that I can see you in the Virginia for Patients Out of Time 30th anniversary event coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeno, for the back history of that. And I think you're right, because you had that PhD background that made things a little easier for you. I know that for patients, when they first find that physician, it's that initial paperwork that gets so tough. So I want to, if we can go back to Alice here and tell us why you started ACT, and then later you got a couple other programs there, and I know it was literally trying to just ease the access for patients.
Mhm. Yes, that's exactly right, Mary Lynn. One of the primary things we did through the Alliance for Cannabis Therapeutics was to try and help people into the Compassionate IND program, and particularly help their doctor through the paperwork process. It's always been interesting to me that the majority of the approved Compassionate IND patients had very unusual conditions and disorders. It seemed easier to get a compassionate IND for some rare disease than it was for a common situation, for example, with AIDS patients in the 90s who were suffering from nausea and vomiting. And we devised a program called the Marijuana AIDS Research Service, or MARS, which streamlined the paperwork. AIDS was a curious disease to work with because it had such a predictable pattern of symptomology and a predictable need for medication. So that made it very easy to simplify the packet that had to be filled out by doctors and their patients. A doctor could fill out the packet in about 20 minutes, as opposed to some of the earlier compassionate INDs, which literally took hours. And it was a laborious process. It was meant to be. The FDA and the DEA did not want to open the doors here to lots of patients. The MARS project totally proved that. We made these packets available to AIDS patients, and they were a huge success, and FDA got flooded with compassionate INDs requests, and that led to the program first of all being suspended and eventually terminated. The 15 existing patients who were receiving marijuana got grandfathered in, but no new applicants were allowed. Now, this effectively slammed the door in the face of thousands of AIDS patients. It was so heartless at the time. It was literally FDA to AIDS patients, drop dead. And it's hard to imagine at that time what that did to the American public, because they had become acclimated to AIDS. They had become more compassionate. And when one avenue of medical relief was shut off to patients with AIDS, America got mad, literally mad. And there were a lot of editorials nationwide criticizing the FDA and the Bush administration for closing the program. And that led directly to the drafting of Prop 215 in California. It's important to remember that in marijuana, no action exists alone. Everything kicks into something else and leads to another action. And that certainly was true in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and of course we're thinking of the hard drugs that people are trying to get away from, and here's cannabis is a plant that they have demonized so well.
Well, absolutely, and we're seeing that today with states that are using it for patients with opioid problems, and the results are phenomenal. We have a lot of U.S. veterans who are living a better quality of life because they're able to access medical cannabis instead of heavy opioids, which was the only thing available to vets with PTSD.
A lot of history with regards to cannabis advocacy that took place before there was the internet, before there were cell phones. And I think that's a really important point and that's why we're doing this Road to 30, so people can really understand the journey that we've been on, that there were court cases going back to 1976 with regards to this type of compassionate access. So thank you so much for your work.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, when you think about it, that was the days of drug testing was alive and well. Started initially with the military, see how that goes, and then bring it out to the public and people using it for everything. And that brings to the drug sniffing dogs at airports and other places. And her being back in that unique situation, again, by 92, there were 15 patients, but in 90, just 5 of you in the United States who could use cannabis. And you had to travel. You were a working person and coming and going, visiting family or travel business. How was that in terms of traveling with this Schedule I substance that, Nancy Reagan had gotten that campaign, Just Say No?
Traveling back then, there wasn't much knowledge of people using medical cannabis. And the first trip I took was to Orlando for a conference for my wife. And so I went to Orlando. I had gone to the police department in Portsmouth, Virginia, told them that I was traveling with a tin can of marijuana, about 6 ounces, and that I want them to have it on file that I'm a federal patient and that I'm not breaking any law. So I figured that would be the best bet because, again, it was just myself and Bob Randall were the only 2 patients. So I went there and to Orlando, and it turned out it was in the 30s temperature-wise. And Debbie and I weren't dressed for that. And so when that big banquet happened Saturday night, people after the dinner lit up cigars, lit up pipes. And I thought, well, hell, if they're lighting that up, I'm just going to light up my joint right here. Well, Debbie said, don't do that, go to the men's room. Okay. So I went to the men's room because you couldn't go outside. It was too cold. And I went to a stall and I started smoking. And lo and behold, a busboy came in and said, hey, that's marijuana. Let me have some of that. I said, I'm very sorry, but that's medical use, from the federal government, and I can't do that. Well, he went outside and called the cops from downstairs, which was a open area where there were people and cops. Cop came up and said, what is that you're doing? I said, I'm taking my federally prescribed medicine from the federal government. So he called his sergeant, who turned out to be a sergeant from the Marine Corps. And the guy, every other word out of his mouth was a cuss word. And the guy came up and said, what are you doing? And I told him what I'm doing. And I said, this is a federal program and that I'm not breaking any law and that the Portsmouth, Virginia Police Department have it on file that it's legal. Well, they didn't care. They busted me and took me to the police station and I was arrested. Now, I guess because of my condition, they never put me in a cell. They put me beside the cell in a wheelchair and figuring, well, I can't move anyway. So, that's what they did. And sure enough, that's how it happened. And it took me about 4 hours before the staff changed and they finally believed me. And what do they keep saying? They kept saying, son, you're in Florida. You're not in Virginia anymore. I said, yes, sir. I said, this is a federal program. Federal law doesn't count. Florida law supersedes federal law. Therefore, you're under arrest. So that's what happened. And then, I traveled quite a bit. I mean, I spoke at like 25 different states for medical marijuana. And one time I'm in the line, and again, I always called the police to let them know I was traveling with a tin can of marijuana. So if the police stopped me going through security, they would say, oh, that's Irvin. It's his medicine. So that's what happened. And this one time, get through security, and I go down to my gate, and at the gate was like 5 lines. It's like 2 people in each line. And at the end was a officer with a dog on a long leash, or a dog with a long leash with an officer on the end. Whatever the case may be, they were sniffing everybody's luggage and the people. So when it came to me, I'm thinking, well, this will be interesting. Well, the dog sniffed myself, sniffed my bag, and nothing happened. So I yelled to the officer. I said, "Excuse me, sir, is that dog trained for drugs or for explosives?" He said, "For drugs." I said, "Well, sir, I don't have anything on me." I said, "Everything's in my carry bag." I said, "I have a tin can from the federal government with about a half a pound of marijuana. Plus, I have about a baggie with maybe 15 joints in there. And you should put the dog back on the bag." So he put the dog back on the bag. The dog sniffed everything and locked in on my wallet in my front pocket. And I looked at the officer. I said, "Sir, I think your dog needs to be retrained because I've got nothing in my front pocket. Everything's in the bag." And I showed him the tin can. I showed him the joints I had open. And when he realized that this was legal, he pulled the dog off of me and walked away with the dog and didn't sniff another bag at all that night. So, my friend just said all I did was educate a dog that should have been, re-educated. But at the time, that's what we had to go up against. Was even though here I was a federal patient, I was still being bothered. I was still being busted. So you couldn't yell, scream, holler. You had to say yes, sir, no, sir, and be very polite and understand that, even though there was only, at that point, there was only Bob Randall and myself as two patients, that we were the anomaly. So therefore, we couldn't take advantage of it as much as we really wanted to.
We've been here only for a short time, and we've already heard about 3 arrests with, otherwise law-abiding citizens just because they were advocating for cannabis use for patients, which is crazy. It shocks the consciousness just to hear that, people who live a good life, worked hard, cared about other people were arrested, and 2 are present on our meeting today. So I just want to highlight, some of the risks and sacrifice that took place that we don't have the appropriate records of as we enjoy this current era of the golden age of cannabis legalization.
I have to say, Cheryl, it always surprises me that people choose to go into cannabis these days, and people choose to go to college and take classes in cannabis. It's just, it's remarkable to me the change that has happened, that people approach this and go, well, this is what I want to do for my life. Whereas for most of us in the early days, we were drafted, we didn't volunteer. So things have really changed.
Things have definitely changed, and we're so grateful for you early pioneers. I want to talk to Zeno really quickly about, making that decision with regards to working with Irv, with your experience by having a PhD, your experience with understanding motion-related disorders. How were you treated by your profession? Because I know physicians who've started way later than you, and they have felt that they've been ostracized by their profession of physicians, and that they are looked at as, whether it's kooks or, with their alternative therapies or their approach to medicine. Let's understand that, because every doctor, even post legalization, having to be a part of a registry, there has to be some fear related to that if the pendulum changes. So can you talk about, making that decision to help to be a part of this cannabis medicine evolution and revolution? And, what does it feel like? What are the risks of being registered as a physician who recommends cannabis? Zeno? I see that you're muted, so we didn't hear you yet.
Yeah, the first step was to convince my chairman of neurology at the University of Miami that to allow me basically to participate in this compassionate use protocol of medical marijuana sponsored by NIDA and NIH. And the fact that it was a federally sponsored study made him relax a bit. But he told me, he said, well, first of all, if the IRB approves it and you get your Schedule I license, then yes, we can definitely do it here in the Department of Neurology. But he says, for your future, I would recommend you not talk about it, because a lot of people have that attitude about any physician who would be participating in any study about marijuana. It would be okay if it was just the active agent like THC or CBD, in other words, a pure drug, then that wouldn't be frowned upon as much. So the other thing that allowed me, that persuaded my chairman of neurology, was that it would open the doors for further research sponsored by NIH to use cannabis for other neurological conditions. And he knew I was very involved in new treatments for Parkinson's disease and related disorders. So I told him, I said, if this is going to work, I'll find out. I'll understand all the ins and outs of doing research with medical marijuana. And I then could eventually apply for further NIH grants to do clinical trials with medical marijuana in either smoked form or in tinctures or extracts to treat various movement disorders. So he really liked that, because what a lot of academic neurology departments like, the more federal grants you get, the better for the university, because the university gets a 50% indirect cost. So if I get $1 million grant, the university gets an additional $500,000. So there's a monetary incentive. In addition, the fact that if you pass muster with NIH, which is very strict in giving out grants, it kind of makes it all legitimate. So I never had a problem, because this was a federally NIH-sponsored study, and I never spoke much to my colleagues about it at all. So because they might have different attitudes.
Very interesting. And I know, Mary Lynn, you have some great stories. I even heard about a road trip where we memorialized it in with a photograph. I want to make sure you get an opportunity to share some of these good times despite the arrests and the stigma.
Oh, no, we did have plenty of good times related to this. That's what's been fascinating. I still run into coworkers who say, Mary Lynn, you're still doing this. And it's like, it's still in Schedule 1. It's been amazing. Irv, I think you have with you, we've been talking about these canisters and how they get cannabis out to how the federal government delivered it. Do you have one of those with you?
Yes, I do. Okay. What I have, and this is not opened. I'm going to open it at our conference. Hopefully I make it in September. But this is one of the tin cans that's still sealed from the federal government. It's got government labels. It says what the strength of the marijuana is, and this has never been opened. Now I do have that's opened this bag. This bag, if you can see, has got a lot of marijuana in it. And this shows you exactly what each joint looks like. So it's like a Camel cigarette is what it looks like. And it's, I can open them up. I can open up one. And basically this is what it looks like. This is the joint. And so, and this one, it's freeze dried. The government freezes it. And so that way it doesn't degrade any worse than it already does. And so the government marijuana that I was getting was basically 10 years old. It was packaged 10 years ago and sitting in a freezer. And for all that time, they put 300 cigarettes in a tin can, and then they seal it, and that's how they ship it out. So I was getting marijuana that was really, really old. But, you didn't care.
Was it tested or any test results shown when they shipped it out to you? Do you even know if the pre-roll was sealed with saliva or with some other more sanitary approach?
It's sealed with glue, and each joint, again, it gives you the THC content of the cigarette itself. And so most of the cigarettes that the government shipped out were 3% THC. So it wasn't what you'd consider strong, but it worked. And that's really all I cared about, was that it worked, because I never got high off marijuana. To this day, I don't. I mean, I've been smoking now since 1971, and I've never gotten high off marijuana. I can get high off tincture, okay, but actually pure plant, material, I don't. But again, it works for me. I don't pull muscles, I don't hemorrhage. So therefore, while it doesn't taste very good and it's not exciting to do, I'm very thankful to have it and have it all these years. Yeah. So.
Yeah, Irv, you mentioned how they freeze dry the marijuana. They don't really treat it with the loving care that we see the entrepreneurs today, the way they treat it. I visited the farm once in Mississippi in 1978, and they had just harvested maybe a quarter of an acre. They rarely use the whole farm, and they just cut it off at the root and then stretch it out over black tarps, and it just bakes out in the Mississippi sun. And that was their idea of curing marijuana. I mean, it just they have no. It's like they've never had an interest in it at all. It's just there's never been any intellectual curiosity that has come that I've seen from the federal government officials in terms of how to manufacture this plant best, how to treat it best, how to listen to patients when they explain things. And it all led Sanjay Gupta a few years back to go on national TV and apologize that he'd been misled and that he didn't believe the patients, he didn't believe the scientists until he had this awakening, and he specifically blamed DEA. It's such a scandal on so many levels. The way patients have been treated, it's awful. It's just awful.
Patients at a time years ago in Montana did a study on the 4 patients to see if it had harmed us in any way. So they did every type of medical facility or a medical test that they could come up with, brainwave testing, IQ testing, you name it. And during that time, LV Musica, George McMahon, and myself opened up a closed tin can. Each of us brought a tin can that the government had shipped us. We opened them up and we took out about 5 joints apiece. And back then, it was not very clean. And so there was all kinds of stems and seeds, and it was pretty raunchy. But we did open them up to show that it was pretty bad as far as, it wasn't very pure. And they didn't believe us. The government didn't believe us. They thought that we added these sticks and stems and the seeds, and no, we didn't. And then right after that, because we complained, right after that, the cannabis became much cleaner to where we weren't receiving the stems and the seeds. And I mean, it wasn't any stronger, but it was cleaner. And so the government at that point took away the argument that it was so, dirty. And they never improved it. They never have. So Dr. El Soli, who was the guy in charge in Mississippi, he never cared. He was just glad to, get his fee for growing it. And he also came up with a new formulation, which was a suppository. And so I think to this day, there's a suppository out there that Dr. El Soli came up with for patients to use. So I never used it.
Nerve, just quickly, as we gathered, as we know now, you're not really in the program anymore. And how's that going with commercial cannabis compared to the federal cannabis?
Yeah, well, since Florida passed laws that made it legal for people to get something from their doctor, to be able to go to a dispensary and to buy, material, that's what I did. I gave up the right to use the cannabis from the federal government. And because I was the last patient to use it, LV was the one before me who stopped using it. once I stopped using it, the government shut the program down. So there is no more government program to join, even if somebody wanted to. To my knowledge, there is none. So even if I wanted to go back to it, they don't have it. So thank God states pass laws, and us in states that have it, such as Florida, we can get our medicine that way.
Alice, you spoke about the lack of, I think you called it like a natural curiosity of the federal government with regards to cannabis as a method of treatment. And you're all aware that now we're going through DEA hearings with regards to scheduling the recommendation from HHS and also the rule created by DEA to go from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I happen to be an attorney representing Veterans Initiative 22. Their executive director, Shanitha Lewis, is super passionate about this subject matter. Can you share what you hope will come out of these hearings? And I know, Irv, you've actually gotten a chance to speak to Shanitha Lewis. She was so honored by you taking time to kind of give her some tips on these types of testimonies. But what are we hoping to get out of these hearings for those of you who've been on this road for so many decades?
Go ahead, Alice.
I think the question is if there are hearings. I read something the other day that they were supposed to start Tuesday, I believe, but they've been canceled. The DEA has a long, long, long history of dragging its feet and coming up with creative ways to stop proceedings and to generally muck up the works. I said muck, okay. It's, but we can all go with something else, we can all go somewhere else if we want to on that. I'm not sure that this rescheduling that everyone is so optimistic about is ever going to happen. And I think it probably will take some kind of action within Congress to get marijuana out of Schedule 1. That's my opinion. I don't trust DEA to do it.
Well, the fact that they want to do it Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 is what they're talking about. I'm more in favor of descheduling to where there's no schedule at all. And there's an argument for that on Capitol Hill. Whether it'll happen or not, who knows? But it would be very important to decriminalize it, deschedule it, so everybody can use it and not worry about being busted.
I want to add to this DEA kind of review, and I'm kind of skeptical, like Alice is, about whether they're going to reschedule it. And I am of the same opinion as Irv that it shouldn't even be on a schedule. It is a plant. It's not a drug. And the drugs that you can derive from the plant, those are the ones that have to be scheduled. Those aren't things you buy over the counter, like the THC, for example, should be something that undergoes testing and is scheduled. In fact, it has done that. It is approved for nausea and vomiting, THC. It's approved for treatment of glaucoma, but not marijuana. Marijuana shouldn't even be scheduled. It was only scheduled because of political reasons. It really should not be.
Yep.
And Zeno, could you go into, you're kind of still pursuing cannabis a little bit, right? Looking into some other uses of it? And to me, that's patients out of time. Our whole thing was not needing, the whole idea of patients out of time was, I think every patient welcomes research. No questions asked. The problem is they know it works and they need it now.
Yeah, so I originally wanted to use the plant itself to treat a set of Parkinson's disease patients, those that had prior experience with it and those that did not. And because I thought that would be a really good adjunct to the use of levodopa, which is the way that we replace dopamine. It's a standard treatment, levodopa, carbidopa, known as Sinemet. But I realized it's going to be very hard to get approval to add a plant in this clinical study without a lot more, obstacles to climb. So I decided to work on new preparations, new formulations of extracts of cannabis that are well defined by analytical testing that we can put into nanoparticles. These are about the size of viruses. We've done this already, and these can be instilled intranasally. So they would act as quickly as smoking without any of the deleterious effects on pulmonary function. So I think if we can get this kind of formulation tested, and we've already done studies in mice where we instill this formulation intranasally in the mice, and we measure its distribution in brain, we measure its effect on locomotion. So and we look for any potential toxic effects. I think eventually, if we could bring this to a clinical trial, it might be a good way. Now, this would have to get DEA approval, and it probably should be more like a Schedule 3 because it contains all of the components of the plant. It isn't just pure THC or CBD. We primarily focus on the ratio of THC, which is the psychotropic component that supposedly, quote, makes you high, gives you a feeling of well-being, and the CBD, which is an anti-inflammatory agent, which is approved at high doses for epilepsy, refractory to other anti-epileptic drugs. So those are things that I was exploring until I retired, but I have associates at the University of South Florida who are continuing this line of research. One is a biotech company, and hopefully this can continue. And certainly anyone who wants to take up the mantle, they can contact me and I'll give them what they would like to carry it on in their own institutions. But so, yeah, that's what I haven't given up on it as a treatment for a number of movement disorders. I know it worked really well for the muscle spasms and rigidity that Irv had. I know from feedback from individual patients that it works for their Parkinson's disease. And I have patients with Huntington's, which have excessive involuntary movements, that use cannabis to control the chorea. A lot of the anti-chorea drugs create Parkinsonism as a side effect. So the nice thing about using cannabis for chorea is that it doesn't have those adverse effects. The downside is that if patient has a lot of cognitive issues as part of their Huntington's disease, they may not tolerate the cannabis as well. I've seen that in one of the patients that reports to me. When I see my Huntington's patients, I have a dedicated clinic every week. I ask them about their use. So I know who's using cannabis and not. A lot of doctors never even inquire about that, but I always did. So I still think there's possibilities for other movement disorders, let alone for the treatment of pain, certainly for epilepsy, for for mood disorders. There's a lot of potential. And, most of the interesting drugs we use nowadays, especially psychoactive drugs, have been derived from plants. It just takes a while to identify which are the best molecules to use and in which combination. So that's, I think, why I'm still interested in looking ahead and participating with this group.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, when we started Patients Out of Time, I think I used to say that to researchers is I want to make you guys, like superstars or something, because they say, oh, there's no research done. Well, it's so hard to do research in the United States. And those who, again, when we're thinking back in the 80s and 90s, people taking a chance to delve into it when generally their bosses and or peers don't think it's such a good idea to go into that field. Alice, before we do close here, I want to make sure you talk about Project 50.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, as I think I mentioned in the opening, the founding of the medical marijuana movement is going to be 50 years old in 2026. And I realized that, a couple years back, I think, and started Project 50 in some ways, it was really a personal goal for me because it gives me a deadline, if you will, about when I need to have, well, the mountain of clippings that I have, for example, and I'll have those scanned and sent off to our archives and that kind of thing. But I'm also trying to do kind of a weekly or every other week what's the word? A blog, sorry, and talk about some of the historical things that happened. And I'm just so pleased with the response I'm getting because people aren't aware of the first 20 years. I blame that directly on the internet, which happened big time starting around 1996 forward. And none of the history has really gotten up onto the internet. I'm working to try and change that. And I do encourage everyone to learn about the past because, you know, if you don't know where you come from, you really don't know where you're going. And I think the past gives us a lot of warnings relative to how marijuana has been, how cannabis has been treated in the past, and how we have misaligned this plant, and the political methods that were used to demonize the plant. All of that is so important to know, and it didn't just happen in the 1930s. You know, it's happening today, even. But particularly, it was happening in the 70s and 80s during the early years of the medical cannabis movement. So I encourage everyone to go to my website, which is aliceo'learyrandall.com, and you can learn more about Project 50 there. Send me some ideas if you want to see something particular or learn about something particular. Just let me know. And I'm always happy to share the history. Always.
Yeah, thank you. You've got a zillion stories to tell because I've listened to many of the podcasts already, or the what you call them, the blogs.
Blogs, yeah.
All righty. You know, I think this does kind of bring us to a close here, and I want to hear from each one at the end. But we hope you guys will continue to join us. Irv and Zeno both mentioned something about studying the patients. We kind of refer to it as the Missoula study because we had them up there when we did these tests. And a later podcast, we'll be having Ethan Russo to talk more in depth about that and the findings, because this is the one time we could say we know what the patients have gotten over time, and let's study them, in fact, you know, by virtue of a known product. And as I said, it was kind of a harsh, low THC product that they did get. And we'll be talking about the hearings, the rescheduling hearings, and I think we all have caution on that. There's been 3 different rescheduling hearings that have gone on. The first one started with ACT and normal, and as we're learning now, the DEA knows how to stall. That's what they do. It's the game they play, and we're seeing it now. But we'll be back with other heroes from our time. Some of them will be having to use family members because we've lost a lot of great people in this battle. But before we leave, if each one just want to give some closing remarks, and I'm going to start with Zeno on this. Just any closing remarks you want to make, look into the future.
Well,
and add your contact information as well, if you don't mind.
You want my contact info?
Closing remarks and contact information.
Okay.
Please.
So I have been working for a while, a couple of years, with a biotech company who is making new formulations of cannabis. And we actually prepared an IND application to the FDA to use this for the treatment of Huntington's disease. And the big issue right now is the stalling by the DEA. So I don't know where it's happening, what's happening next. But I'm basically a consultant on that potential study, and I helped write the protocol because my successor in the Huntington's clinic agreed to take and to supervise the study if it's ever awarded, and we would use the patients from our HD clinic. So I think if you want any more information about future studies with cannabis for movement disorders, you can contact me at my personal email, Xenographia, ZENOGRAFIA @gmail.com. I'm not giving my academic email, though I still have it. The nice thing about being a professor emeritus is that I have a lot of the privileges. I keep my email, I have free access to the library and to various facilities on campus. But I'd rather any kind of quest come to me via xenographia @gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you. Irv, any closing remarks?
It's been many, many, many years that we've been trying to educate people about what we're trying to do and how important the medicine is. And that's what we're still doing. We're still trying to let people know that this is a needed medicine and that people aren't crazy to think that marijuana actually helps them in certain disorders. So again, I can be gotten at skipperirv@aol.com. And because I sail, that's where the skipper comes in. And it's important that we all keep educating the public, because until it's approved overall, right now there are still people in jail for it. There are still people that are worried to be arrested for it. And so we need to make it to where it's safe and people aren't worried and they can talk about, how well it does for them and not be scared. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Alice?
Yes, well, building a little bit on what Irv said, I think it's so important that we keep medical cannabis alive, because there's a real push to find the single molecule, find the synthetic route, build the perfect single molecule that's just like cannabis, which is pretty pie in the sky as far as I'm concerned. But nevertheless, there is that push there, and there's so much that the cannabis plant has to offer us. To me, it's every day with cannabis is like the universe. It just keeps expanding outward and outward and outward, and we learn something more about it and something new, and it's just an amazing plant. Now, for the purpose of why we're here today, I just want to say congratulations to Patients Out of Time, because 30-year anniversary, Marilyn, you came along just as Bob and I were having to leave the scene because he was so ill. And I look back on it, the timing couldn't have been better, because the Compassionate IND program had shut down. Patients didn't have any avenues. Well, I mean, they were starting to because of Prop 215 and everything that led to. But I've always felt that the focus that you and Al had on getting the education out there was just so perfectly timed. And you really you brought in a lot of the outside folks, the people in Europe, Spain, Israel. Israel. We love Israel for their marijuana cannabis work. And just as another little side note, thank God that Raphael Mechoulam emigrated to Israel and not the U.S., because we I don't know where we'd be if Professor Mechoulam hadn't done what he did. So, but anyway, congratulations on 30 years, and I certainly hope you don't have to do 30 more. So,
Goodness, I don't think I'd last 30 more years.
Yeah. I want to add a comment to what Alice said about what FDA likes to see and what DEA likes to deal with is the single isolated molecule that would do what the medical cannabis plant does. And that's an impossible dream, because what we've learned since the analyses of medical cannabis has gotten more and more refined, that there's a whole range of terpenoids and other constituents beyond the cannabinoids that allow it to act better. We call it the entourage effect. We know that having the combination of those components, and it has to be in the right proportion for it to have the same effects as the plant itself. It'll never be quite like the plant, but you can mimic it a bit. And the best way to approach it is to do extracts of all the components and study those. And if you define the amount of each component, then maybe DEA and FDA would approve its use. But I'm of the opinion, and just like what Alice had said earlier, what Irv says, that the plant itself should not be regulated. It should be available, certainly as a starting point for treatment of a range of conditions. It has very minimal adverse effects and is effective for quite a number of conditions and would not require FDA or DEA involvement. Only if we want to advance the science should we work on this molecules and the entourage effect to define another formulation for a cannabinoid-like agent that would replicate many of the same benefits of the plant itself.
Well said. I think, that's it. This road to 30, we hope you'll join us every month leading up to the conference, September 14th to the 16th. It'll be the 16th National Clinical Conference on Cannabis Therapeutics. And as usual, it's an interdisciplinary team, try to bring folks from the US as well as outside the US so you get that bigger picture. We certainly look forward to seeing you. So happy to have our first three guests with Alice, Irv, and Zeno to join us. Truly some of my heroes. So look forward to our next podcast.
And as Mary Lynn has indicated, we're excited about this conference coming up September 14th and 16th, 14th through the 16th in Charlottesville, Virginia. We're hoping that you'll join us. You are going to see our podcast guests at the conference in person. Many of them have books. We have archives. We're discussing an exhibit area. We always have books for signing and book signings. So we're glad that you're on this journey with us. Tune in for the next episode. Share, let other people know what we're doing here, what we have been doing here. And we look forward to seeing you on the road to 30.